Hey, I'm Plini.
Hey, I'm Simon, and I'm going to show you how I dial in and mix guitar tones with Plini. Okay, so before we touch anything within our DAW, we want to make sure that the basics are covered. Firstly, the instrument that you're tracking with has to be properly set up for the tuning, playing style, and the gauge of strings you're using. If you don't know how to do this yourself, there's a lot you can learn online, or you could just take it to a local guitar tech who will do that for you. Next, we want to plug in our guitar and set the input gain on our interface. You'll probably notice a fairly drastic variation in dynamics depending on the guitar's pickup selection and the part you're playing. Most of the time you can find a sweet spot on your preamp gain where the loudest parts of your playing aren't clipping, but the quietest parts are still getting picked up properly. Just note that while this rule should generally work for all your guitar tracking, keep an eye on that input meter just in case you might need to make any adjustments. Now that we have those things covered, let's just quickly talk about tuning for a second. There's a lot of decent tuners available these days, whether they're pedals, rack units, plugins, even some of the high-end clip-on headstock tuners all do a decent job in my experience. Surprisingly, the biggest tuning problems I come across usually stem from the players themselves. Just things like squeezing down too hard on the fretboard, changing seating positions when tracking, applying too much pressure to the palm when palm muting, and even just picking too hard can all cause tuning issues. These things will only become more and more obvious when your guitar tracks start to stack up in your sessions, such as doubling rhythm guitars or layering lead guitars and their harmonies, for example. So with all these physical habits in mind, it's good practice to be checking your tuning every couple of takes so that things are where they should be. Alright, enough of that stuff. So once we've got everything recorded, we can now talk about how I dial in tones for a mix. As we're going to be working on Plini's song Salt and Charcoal, I figured it'd be a good move to use the Archetype Plini plugin he developed with Neural DSP. I think it's worth pointing out that this plugin wasn't available during the time I originally mixed this record, so for this video I thought it'd be interesting to try and replicate those tones as close as possible while relying on nothing but the plugin's own EQ, effects, amps and cabs. That said, Neural DSP will be including these presets in the plugin's next update, which should be available to you guys by the time you're watching this video. I'll throw a link to their website in the description box where those who already own the plugin can download this update. And for those that haven't checked this plugin out yet, you can download a free 14-day trial there too. Alright, so the first rhythm tone is kind of like an overdriven split coil thing, more or less trying to mimic something similar to a Strat. Its main purpose is to have a really exaggerated string attack that cuts through the mix while not being too distorted that all the notes within the chord just get buried. Let's now take a quick listen to it and then I'll talk about the settings I used. Okay, pulling up the plugin. A common theme that you'll notice as we move through this preset is all the boost to the high end across different parameters. This is basically just going to be helping us bring out that string attack that I spoke about. Looking at the front panel of the amp, I've engaged the bright switch and boosted the treble and presence dials. As we've double tracked and hard panned these guitar parts left and right, a common thing you'll see me doing is dipping the mids just a touch to clean up any annoying boxy frequencies that usually build up when layering guitar tracks. The bass dial has been slightly boosted to beef things up, but watch you don't overdo it here as this is a common place where things can get really muddy. The gain dial is set reasonably high, but this is because I've trimmed back the signal going into the amp via the input control here. This allows me to get a little more resolution from the amp's gain dial so that it only starts to distort when I really push it. One might argue that you could just record your guitar's DI with less preamp gain, but I'd personally prefer to record a strong signal that I can trim back later in my DAW. Overall, remember we want just enough distortion where it can sound punchy and exciting without oversaturating things to the point that we can't even hear the actual notes being played. Moving on to the pedal section before the amp, I've got the compressor bypass, but I am using the overdrive pedal to once again enhance that top end by boosting the tone dial. I'm then pushing some extra signal into the front of the amp with the level dial, and the drive itself is actually completely backed off as we're not trying to use any of its distortion for this exact situation. Now if we look at the cab section, there's nothing too complex going on. A single mic slightly off axis to fatten things up and to avoid any harsh top end, which can all be controlled by the position dial here. Aside from the common 57, the Ribbon 121 is one of my favourite mics for guitar cabs, both within this plugin and its real life counterpart. It adds a ton of body and weight behind things instead of having to make drastic EQ moves to the low end. Finally, we'll move to the graphic EQ section. We've cut back on some of the extreme lows with the 65Hz slider. This is a common area where guitars can really get in the way of the drums and bass, so cutting here won't be an issue. If you're looking to add more low end to your guitars here, I suggest boosting anywhere between 150 to 250 Hz depending on the music. As you can see, I've done exactly this by boosting 250, and I've also made a slight boost at 500 just to bring out some of the more grainy qualities. All of the remaining boosts at 1K, 4K, and 8K are just increasing more of that string attack I keep mentioning. Alright, onto the second rhythm guitar tone. This particular part is meant to sit slightly under the main rhythm guitars I just showed you. It's important to point out that this is actually a completely different musical idea with enough similarities to the original rhythm parts that the two separate ideas blend together. They lock rhythmically, they're in the same key, and are even panned in the same place within the stereo field as the other rhythm guitars, but due to the slight differences in register, tone, and note choice, when played together they almost sound like one really dense, massive single guitar track. I'll let you listen to how the two tones interact, and then continue explaining the second rhythm guitar's settings. Okay, so here are the first pair of rhythm guitars. Here's the second pair. And here they are together. So the second rhythms have a fairly typical high gain sound using the lead amp with a healthy boost on the bass dial and a small cut in the mids again like last time. The treble hasn't been touched, but we've gained enough clarity from a slight bump in the presence and by flicking on that bright switch. Remember, we did a lot of drastic high-end enhancement on the other rhythms, so we don't need to go too crazy here. The amp's gain dial is quite low because we're using the overdrive pedal as a boost before the amp, so no drive and a lot of output level. This kind of thing has been a common trick amongst engineers and guitarists for decades for when they need to tighten up an unruly high-gain amp. A byproduct of this technique is that you tend to lose a fair bit of low end, so that's why I've rectified this by boosting the bass dial and also here on the EQ where the only adjustment has been a small boost at 250. Finally, to the cab section, I've used the Dynamic 57 mic, which is more mid-focused and less bassy than the 121 we used before, and I've shifted it even further off axis to achieve a darker sound. Moving on to the first of two clean tones I'll be showing you in this clip. This is a fairly mellow, simple part that doesn't need much explaining, but it's important that I point out something here. Both of these clean tones I'm going to show you use stereo time-based effects in some way, so make sure that you select a stereo instance of the plugin when setting up your track. In Logic, it's simply done by going over to your channel strip, selecting the plugin, and choosing stereo from these options. Alright, back to checking out this clean tone. Looking at the amp, I've got the bright switch on and the presence boosted to bring out the percussive qualities of the pick attack. The mids are dipped to further improve clarity, and the bass is boosted for some warmth. I don't want any breakup or drive on this tone at all, so the gain dial stayed put and I applied some heavy compression on the way into the amp via the compressor pedal just to even the whole performance out a bit. You'd be surprised by how little dynamic range you actually need for most clean guitar parts within a mix, so I'd suggest experimenting with all kinds of compressors and listen to how placing them before or after an amp can affect things differently. Over on the cab section, we have a Dynamic 421, which is great for bringing out the clarity and pick attack on cleans. It's positioned on axis directly in front of the speaker's cap, which will result in a really bright tone. Once again, we're adding more top end with the graphic EQ by boosting the 4, 8 and 16 kHz sliders. Clean guitars generally respond well to fairly aggressive high-end boosts versus other tones such as heavily distorted guitars, so feel free to experiment with what can be done in this area. On this tone, we're going to take advantage of the time-based effects section by adding some reverb. I'm going for a fairly obvious effect, so increasing the wet dial will help with that. The space dial is cranked, which is going to create a really wide atmosphere that you wouldn't usually get from a single guitar part, and then I've bumped up the time just past halfway for a longer reverb tail. Now these two guys here are really useful and sometimes overlooked in my opinion, so I thought they deserved a little more explanation. Extreme lows and highs are common but rarely useful in most guitar sounds as it's mainly a mid-range focused instrument. It's worth considering that even though you may be happy with a certain tone you've dialed in, You might notice that once you kick in any reverb, the low end completely smothers and overwhelms the original performance, or maybe you just get seconds upon seconds of abrasive, shrill high end trailing over the top that could do with some taming. By using these high and low pass filters, you're able to control any unruly low end or harsh high end while still retaining the ambience you wanted in the first place when turning on the reverb. Note that these filters are only applied to the pedal's wet signal and not to your guitar's original tone. So try maxing out the wet dial and adjusting the two filters to hear exactly how these are working. Alright, so I've got a couple of interesting tricks going on with this next clean, so I'll give you a listen and then I'll explain it all. Firstly, nothing really drastic going on with the amp section. The bright switch is on and I've bumped up some of the low end with the bass dial. As this part was tracked with fingers instead of a pick, if we go over to the compressor, I've got it squeezing down fairly hard on the signal and the gain is dialed all the way back. The reason for such a low output from the compressor is that I don't want any chance of my signal distorting the front end of the amp. The other reason is that I've completely bypassed the cabinet simulation, which results in a fairly dramatic increase in volume. If you're wondering how this can be done, just right-click or double-click the speaker symbol here. Now, this may seem like a pretty strange thing to do, but you'll instantly notice an almost acoustic guitar-like quality from your electric tracks as a result. Guitar cab impulse responses are more or less just a really complex EQ curve, with most of them commonly shaving off a lot of high end. This is generally a positive thing in most guitar sounds, especially distorted ones, but in this situation it just kind of works. Quickly checking out the graphic EQ, nothing much has changed except a few boosts to the lower frequencies that we would usually get from the cab. The next trick I've done here uses the delay pedal in a bit of an unorthodox way. Stay with me here as it gets a little complex, but I'll try and explain my reasoning behind every decision so that hopefully it makes sense. Firstly, I've completely maxed out the wet dial so that the original signal is no longer heard. Once we've covered the following steps, you'll understand why, but for now, I only want to hear the effect that this pedal is doing and nothing else. The delays of this pedal are naturally a little dark, so cranking the tone dial will bring back any clarity we've lost. The feedback dial goes all the way down so that once a single note is played, only a single note delay follows behind it. I then turned the sync switch off as I'm not trying to create any rhythmic delays that require syncing to the tempo of my project. We then activate the ping pong switch, which will push the delays out wide to my left and right speakers. Now, if we'd left any of the dry signal dialed in, you would still hear it playing in the center of your speakers alongside of the wider ping pong delays, which is not what we're going for here. I then turned the time dial all the way down and adjusted the tempo so that the number here is reading somewhere around 18 milliseconds. Okay, so what we've essentially created is a stereo doubling effect. So your guitar part will play through the left speaker first, and then 18 milliseconds later it will play through the right. This gives off a similar effect as if two guitar parts were recorded and panned hard left and right. Although it is worth noting that this trick doesn't quite have the right characteristics to replace the traditional concept of double tracking and hard panning guitar tracks, but it can be a cool trick to add some dimension to a mono guitar by kind of giving it its own unique spot in the stereo field. Try this on all kinds of different guitar sounds to see what it can do for you. After all this, we flick on the mod switch, which will give us kind of like a chorus style effect, and we crank up the tape saturation. Saturation is a really handy tool that can be best described as kind of like a really subtle form of distortion. Applying this to something super dynamic like this capless clean tone we have here will really help it sit evenly in the mix. Finally, I switched on the reverb pedal for some atmosphere with similar settings as before, but this time I left a bit more top end in there, which seemed like the right idea for such a bright tone. Alright, so the very last one I'll be covering is a high gain lead sound that I typically use to sit on top of the more massive sections of Plini's music. Something that will cut through a big wall of drums, bass, strings, and guitar layers without being too harsh or intrusive. As always, we'll have a listen to it and I'll explain it. Looking at the amp, I'm sure you can tell by now that I really like the bright switch, so that's on, and the rest of the EQ isn't touched aside from a slight boost in presence. This amp has a lot of gain on tap, so not much was needed here. Looking at the pedals before the amp, I'm using the overdrive pedal as a typical boost again, like you saw me using in the high gain rhythm tone, but this time I've also got the compressor squeezing down on things as well. This gives us an increase in sustain, which can be heard in longer notes, and a smoother, thicker sound overall. On the cab, I've used a dynamic 57 off-axis to capture more of a darker, warmer sound. This tends to be a better approach when trying to create a bit of separation for a lead that has to sit in a track with such bright rhythm and clean guitars surrounding it. You'll see I've taken this even further on the graphic EQ by shelving off 8 and 16K and boosting some of the body at 250 and 500. The significant dips at 65 and 125 are just tidying up some of that low end. Finally, a much more typical approach to this effects section where I've got a standard quarter note ping pong delay synced to the tempo of the project with a subtle amount of repeats set by the feedback dial, and the wet dial is set somewhere around 25%. The tone is slightly boosted past halfway, and I've got a bit of tape saturation going on too. Alright, we are done. One thing before I go, I realize this is going on the internet, so for those that might be thinking I have some secrets going on behind the scenes, there are 2 other plugins in this session that I'll quickly explain right now. I have all the rhythm guitars routed to a bus with a stock Logic EQ loaded on it that's just filtering out everything below 100 Hz. This is just a further safety net that has a bit more precision to catch any of that extreme low end I keep talking about. The other thing is a bus compressor I just threw on my master to glue everything together when the full mix is playing back. Aside from that EQ on the bus, there is no other post-processing going on in the guitars outside of the Archetype plugin. Alright, so I hope you're able to learn something from this video and maybe even make some presets of your own. Remember, you can always save them by clicking this button here and locate them with this magnifying glass button here. You can also just drag and drop files directly into the plugin like this from anywhere on your computer. If you like this video or have any questions, let me know in the comments, and thanks for watching.